I wonder if you still use cash. In 2019, I was having a chat with my local greengrocer. Seems a world away, 2019, doesn't it? Anyway, I bought a small amount of items and I had the right change in my wallet. So I was keen to get rid of it. And when I went to pay with cash, his response was surprise, because he's just used to tap and go. So I asked him about his thoughts on how long do you think it'll be until we're cashless? I figured if anybody would know, it would be a greengrocer. So I was surprised by his answer. He said, I'll give it 5 years. I said, wow, 5 years, naively thought. Little did I know how fast-tracked that would become in a few short months. It just feels like that 5 years turned into 5 minutes almost overnight. Change comes about as a response to problems. And in the first few months of 2020, do you remember them? We were more fixated on surfaces for the transfer of virus, and the change of money became a great big potential surface. So many businesses went cashless very quickly, and many of us just decided to go cashless. It seemed like a simple solution, especially with the ease of cards and phones and even watches. But I don't use cash much anymore. And this provided a timely example of how disruptive change impacts our lives. There's been so much change in the last couple of years, haven't there? We've become normalized to video conferencing, to mask wearing, and even QR codes have finally found their purpose in life. I do think that this capacity to meet and work virtually will be a lasting effect of the pandemic. Today, I'm talking to you about progressing or guessing. Really, this means that problems are at the heart of life. They can be big problems and small problems. There can be incremental change or disruptive change like we're experiencing now. It feels like, though, we exist to solve problems, especially now. And the title of this webinar presents a choice: deliberate, strategic progressing, or hoping for the best and just guessing. As I wrote in the descriptor for this webinar, each of us spend the day consciously and unconsciously solving problems. And up until recently, we could travel through life with a reasonable degree of predictability and certainty, confident of reaching a desired outcome. We've talked about how many of us have chosen to be cashless, and as a critical mass, we've created a big change and fast-tracked, well, according to my greengrocer at least, the shift from hard currency to the cashless society. The other part of the webinar I wrote, today we are increasingly faced with a barrage of complex problems. These are ones with multiple mitigating variables, multiple plausible options, and multiple consequential outcomes. Year on year, we could just map out the next 12 months with a degree of confidence. We could plan travel and holidays. But all of a sudden, all of those plans we put in place were in disarray. About the same time, beginning of last year, I began to put my head down to write the thesis for my PhD. In case you're wondering how long a thesis is, mine is about the same length as Harry Potter's Chamber of Secrets. Anyway, with a prompt from my supervisors, I began exploring complexity theory. It could not have been more timely. I've been studying the success and the sustainability of teacher transformation to innovative learning environments. And over the last decade or so, I've travelled and visited many, many schools. I began to get curious, especially after return visits. Why did some schools manage to maintain the innovative teaching and learning in those spaces? And why did others seem to default to the traditional model? This was the context of my research, and complexity theory emerged, and complexity emerged as the underpinning theory. I'll explain it in detail a little later, but essentially complexity recognises that there are circumstances where simple cause and effect problem-solving processes may not easily apply. And these are the ones with multiple mitigating variables. There are a number of impacting considerations. Multiple plausible options. There's just not a single viable solution to these problems, and multiple consequential outcomes. The destination may be different than we anticipated. That's pretty much 21 to 22 in a nutshell, isn't it? We can think of a series of problems to solve, positive and negative situations that might emerge, incremental and disruptive impacts. The last 2 years has disrupted our business as usual attitudes, and education, along with many other sectors, has had to pivot. And we are all well aware of this in our personal and our professional lives. But as a glass half full kind of person, I like to look ahead and see what we can learn and what we can gain in the midst of adversity. And I recently came across this article in The Atlantic. It was published just as school was returning in the US. And there is some telling insight here, beginning with the title. The pandemic broke a fundamental principle of teaching. Are you curious? The introduction says, many of us for the first time in our career have no idea what our students know on the opening day of school. It goes on to quote a teacher at the start of a new semester. Oops, sorry. I'm now trying to prepare a million different options for whatever greets me on day one. What about this one? Lesson plans we've relied on for decades will no longer work for our students. And nobody knows what to expect. It's impossible to plan. Welcome to complexity. The journalist writes, the solution is complex. That's because and I wondered, what is that fundamental principle? I think it's predictability, to be honest, because there are multiple mitigating variables, multiple plausible options, and multiple consequential outcomes. Education has always been complex. We've talked for too long about moving from the factory, from the one-size-fits-none model. Perhaps it just took the pandemic to shake it up. I believe that change and problem solving go hand in hand. Something happens and it makes us think. The teacher in that article could no longer rely on the lesson plans she'd used for decades. Nah, not much has happened in the last few decades, has there? So there are important implications for our work with schools, for the practice of teachers, for the leadership posture that's required in complexity, and for the physical environment. But before we get there, each of us have gone through massive change in personal and professional lives. And I'm wondering about, what's something that you've stopped doing, that you started doing over these last couple of years? What we're going to do in this webinar is just pause for a bit, have some dialogue. We'd love to hear from you, and then we'll go back into some more content.